Today I'm going to do a walkthrough with you on the MiRu Ruffle Sock. This sock is sized everywhere from toddler all the way to an adult extra large, which is a 10-inch circumference, 23 centimeters. So what I want to do, I'm just going to take this mostly line by line, section by section in the pattern, and we're going to walk through everything that you need to know to make this sock and hopefully clear up any questions you might have as you go along. So a basic intro to the sock. When you are choosing the size that you want to make, it starts with a foot circumference of 4 inches, which is 10 centimeters, and goes all the way up through 10 inches. And that measurement, where you're measuring, is around the circumference of your foot. So you'll take your tape measure, measure here, and you'll want to size down. That way your sock isn't loose on your foot. So if it's like an 8.5, you'll want to make a size 8, which would be the 8-inch size. If you've never knit patterns with multiple sizes before, one thing you'll notice is that there's all kinds of numbers in parentheses. What that references to is the sizes. So if you're making a size 5, that's the first number in the first set of parentheses. So every time you see an instruction where it says you're going to do something and then there's a whole bunch of numbers, you're going to use the number in the corresponding position. So in this specific spot, it would be the number 6 because it's the first number in the first set of parentheses. So what might help is once you figure out what size that you're going to be knitting, go through the rest of the pattern and highlight all the numbers in the number sets that correspond to your size that you're making. That way, as you're knitting along, you don't get confused and accidentally knit a number that corresponds to the wrong size. This sock calls for fingering weight yarn, sock weight yarn. It's a number 1 if you're using the number scale. So that's what you want to use. I recommend a wool yarn for this. You could use acrylic, but you want to be picky about acrylics with socks because some acrylics, they don't stretch well, they don't hold their shape, and they don't breathe well, which is something that you really want in a sock. Since our feet need a lot of air, you don't want to put on a sock that's going to hold all that moisture in your foot. It's got to be breathable. So I definitely recommend a wool yarn for this. I knit this sample in Cascade's 220 fingering yarn, and it worked really nicely. So highly recommend it. It washes well, it holds its shape, and it's got good stretch to it. The needles you're going to be using are a US 1 or a 2.25 millimeter needle. So I prefer working on 5D double pointed needles, DPNs, so I can have 4 needles on the sock and then 1 more needle to knit with. If you'd rather use circulars, do magic loop, 2 at a time, whatever you want to do, that's up to you. Other things that you're going to need 3 stitch markers. You're going to need a removable stitch marker, a beginning of round marker, and then you'll also, this is optional, but I highly recommend it, you'll want elastic thread. Let me grab. So this is elastic thread. It's basically just really thin elastic on a spool like this. And I like to use it on the cuff of socks because it makes the cuff a lot stretchier, so it's more like a store-bought sock, the way it fits more comfortably. And in this case, I use it up here at the cuff so it holds its shape while it fans out for the ruffle. And that is all the basics that we need to know going into the sock. It's knit toe up, so we'll start with, I'll show you my favorite way to cast on for a toe up sock. You can use any cast on method that you like. And then there's all the abbreviations for the sock, which are just standard abbreviations. If you're confused with any of these, you can look them up. There's all kinds of tutorials on YouTube. But with that being said, let's go ahead and cast on and get started. I want to give you a quick walkthrough on the full shaping of everything, the entire sock. So the heel on this sock is a heel that I made up specifically to have a heel that fits more like a heel flap when you're knitting top down, but that you can knit toe up. I really like the fit of a heel flap. I haven't found another method of heels that I really love for my foot. So I kind of made this up. It's a heel turn that mimics a top-down heel flap as best as I could come up with. So what we're going to do after we make our increases for our toe and we knit all of the foot section, we're going to get to the increases on the heel. So this little triangle here, that's very typical of a heel flap, we're going to start making these increases on each side of the foot. It's going to split here, we'll be making increases. Then we're going to take some stitches just at the bottom and we're going to work short rows. You can see that it's rounded off down there. That's what matches when you're doing a heel turn for your heel flap. You get to the bottom of the flap itself and then you do a bunch of short rows that make like a little triangle heel turn. We're working short rows over here the other way so that you still get that shape from that. And then after we've done those short rows, we're going to turn and we're going to start working across, picking up and decreasing stitches along these increases, and that's what gives us that nice line there. Once we've finished that, we'll work a couple rows and we'll do ribbing at the top, and then we're going to work a bunch of purl rows for the fold over cuff, and then that gets attached, and then we're going to flare it out for the fun little ruffle on there. Since this sock is knit toe up, I'm going to start with my favorite toe up cast on method. Make sure you used a closed cast on method. You don't want to knit on it or cast on in the round and then you have no closed toe. So make sure you use a toe up specific cast on. I am not going to be following a number set for any of the specific sizes in this pattern. I'm going to make an extremely small sample just so I can walk you through all of the techniques in the pattern, and then you can reference the pattern for the actual size that you would like to make. So for this cast on, what I'm going to start with is a slip knot. And you don't have to start with a slip knot for this method, it just makes it a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with just, all you need is 2 of your needles. And you'll need 2 needles, whether you're using double pointed or circulars, you'll need 2 ends of your needles. This needle, I'm going to call the needle closer to me. This needle I will reference as the needle farther from me. So I'm going to take my slip knot and slide it onto the needle that's closer to me and pull it tight. And then I'm going to take both ends of my yarn and hold it into my fingers like this, kind of like I'm doing a long-tailed cast on. And then it's really simple. All I'm going to do, this is going to be counted as stitch 1. I'm going to take my needles to the left of the yarn closer to me and then wrap it in between the needles through the middle. Then I'm going to go to the other side and wrap the yarn between the needles. So the yarn on the left is being wrapped around the right needle. The yarn on the right is being wrapped around the left needle. Or if we're holding it this way, the closer yarn is being wrapped around the farther needle. The farther yarn is being wrapped around the closer needle. And I'm just going to keep going back and forth like this until I've cast on the number of stitches that the pattern calls for. I'm going to cast on, I guess, 8 stitches. I'll do 10. Make it a little bit easier for my increases. So this is 10 stitches. I've got 5 stitches on each needle. I'll bring that closer to see if you can see that. There we go. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches on this needle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches on the farther needle. And the reason you want to finish wrapping this farther needle is because when we start knitting, we're going to start with this closer needle. And having this wrapped on top of this yarn locks this needle into place, so we're not trying to knit with yarn that's still a little bit loose. So now that we've cast on our stitches, I'm going to take a third needle and we'll begin knitting. This first round, we're just going to follow the pattern. Says to knit. What I typically do to make it a little bit easier to hold these stitches, this first needle I'm going to split onto 2 separate needles, and then this third needle I'm going to keep all of my stitches on 1 needle, and that's kind of how I mark my rounds. Instead of using a beginning of round marker at this point, I'm going to add that when I'm done with my increases at the toe. But at this point, I split this onto 2 needles so it's easier to work with, and then I just remember, okay, the beginning of the round is the 2 needles with fewer stitches, and the end of the round is the needle with more of the stitches on it. So I'm going to begin. This first row is a little bit difficult. The stitches are typically a little tight for this, but I'm going to knit across. So I'll go 3 stitches, and then I'm going to grab my next needle. And you'll notice these first 3 stitches, I knit with the working end of my yarn and the tail end of my yarn. It locks the tail in a little bit, and then I don't need to weave in my ends when I'm done. I still usually do anyway a little bit just to make sure that it's really locked in there. But it just gives you a much more closed end at this side. It doesn't tend to separate as much. I do this regardless of if I'm toe up or top down. If I'm just knitting in the round, I find that if I knit them both together, it locks in my tail end really nicely. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab 1 more needle. And this is going to be a lot of needle for not very many stitches, but it's just very uncomfortable, for me anyway, to knit on just 2 needles. For you it might work. But when I add in 1 more needle, it gives this nice bend over here that makes it a little bit easier to get my needle in. Let's see if I can get that. It gets pretty tight towards the end. If you need to knit into it backwards, so top to bottom instead, I'm going to do that right now. Go ahead and do that. It's not going to mess anything up at this point. But if that's the only way you can get your needle into this first round, then go ahead and do that. Alright, and then I'm going to knit across my second needle. Alright, there we go. So we've made it across round 1. And if you split your needles up differently, if you're on 4 needles at this point, or if you just like having your beginning of round marker in there right away, go ahead and place your beginning of round marker. That would be right here. And let's get started with row 2. So, or this is round 3 technically. So in instructions, round 3, this is where we're going to start the increases for our toe. It's going to be make 1 left and make 1 right increases. For this first needle, this is just a weird little trick that I do to make my first round a little bit easier while it's still very, very tight. Since I knit these first few stitches with both the tail end of the yarn and the working yarn, I actually knit on the first stitch both of those as separate stitches. That gives me my first increase without having to do a make 1 left, which when your needles or when your stitches are this tight at the beginning, it can be a little bit frustrating to do so. So I'm gonna separate those 2 strands, and I'm gonna knit each of those as a separate stitch, and then I'll work to the end. Now if you don't want to do that little trick, it's a make 1 left right there. So you would knit 1, make 1 left. Let's move to the end of the first half of our stitches. All right, so this is the last stitch of our first half, so we're going to stop and we're going to do a make one right, which is going to be right here. We're going to pick up, let's see if that'll focus here. We're going to pick up this little leg between our stitches, insert our needle, and then we're going to insert our needle through the other direction so that that loop gets twisted. Let's see if I can focus in here a little bit more. There we go. So I'm going to knit that. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on a make one right, make one left, there are lots of good tutorials out there. Just go ahead and search make one left, make one right. If I make one, I'll go ahead and link it to this video. But otherwise, there's all kinds of great tutorials out there. This is really just to give you a rundown on this specific sock and not each of the individual standard tutorials or the techniques. I just want to give you a rundown on all my strange random techniques that I do throughout and any tips that I can give to you. So now this is the second half of our needles, second half of our stitches. I'm going to knit one. I'm going to make one left. So I'm going to pick up this little leg between the stitches, pull it onto my left needle, get my right needle to the back of the stitch, and knit that. Let's make one left. We're going to knit up to the last stitch of the second half of our stitches, and we'll do a make one right. So I'll pick it up from the front, put it on my left needle, and then we twist that stitch. That's what avoids the gap, avoids the hole in your toe, and then knit the last stitch. So that's round 3 in the pattern. Now the next round we're going to knit. So every round is going to alternate. We're going to do one round plain knit, and then the next round we're going to increase at each edge of this halves of stitches. So we have the first half of our stitches, the second half of our stitches, and every time we increase, we're going to increase at each corner, one stitch in. So I went ahead and did round 4 off camera since it's just plain knit. You can see that we're starting to get a few more stitches in here. It's not so tight anymore. It's a lot easier to work each of the stitches now. I am going to walk through one more round of the increases just to make sure that it's clear, and then move on. So we're going to knit one, make one left. So the little line we've got here, the leg between our stitches, we're going to pick that up from the back and knit, and then knit across to where the pattern tells you. If you have your stitches on 4 double pointed needles at this point, you're going to knit, you're going to increase after one stitch on the first needle, you're going to increase before the last stitch on the second needle, after one stitch on the third needle, and before the last stitch on the fourth needle. So this is the second needle. I've knit up to the last stitch. We're going to do a make one right. So I'm going to put my needle in from the front of that leg, move it onto my left, and then I'm going to twist the stitch and knit the next stitch. And now this is the second half of my stitches. So I'm going to knit one, make one left, and knit to the last stitch of this half, I'm going to make one right. So you can see that leg right there between the stitches. That's what I'm picking up. And I'm going to change the direction that my needle is inserted into it to twist that stitch. I'll knit the last stitch of the round, and that is round 5. So you're going to keep, the next round will be knit, and then you'll do another round of increases and continue that pattern until you have a total number of stitches that it tells you. So after round 6, it says repeat rounds 5 to 6 until there are X number of stitches total. Find the stitch or find the number that corresponds to your size depending on the placement of the number in the set. Highlight that number, and once you have that many stitches total around all of your needles, that's when we're going to move on to the foot. So now I have worked several rows of increases and made this tiny little toe. And I did a couple extra increases so I would end up with the same number of stitches on each needle. So I have 8 stitches on each of my needles. Now I'm ready to begin the foot. And so now I am going to split into 4 needles. This is when it's usually comfortable for me. The pattern is written to start with 4 needles, so whatever works for you. I really like it this way just because I don't have to put a beginning of round marker in yet. I just remember every time I get past the longest needle, I'm at the beginning of the round. But now I am going to put my beginning of the round marker in since I'm starting the foot. And I have a little trick here that you can use. If you don't want to use a beginning of round marker, I'll take my tail end of my yarn and I pop that through to the right side of my work. And then I knit over that and just leave this hanging out of the sock the entire time I make the rest of the sock. And then this hanging here just reminds me of what side is the beginning of the round. So I use this, just the tail end, as my beginning of round marker. If you need something right at the beginning of the round to remind you when you get to that point, there are some patterns that I make that I need something right at the beginning. I don't want to have to look down. So I do place a beginning round marker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my, what I call my beginning of the round marker. Get it? Because it's a sheep. And so I'll put this after the first stitch. So I'm going to grab one more needle. And I'm going to leave this out so you can see what this looks like as you keep knitting if you wanted to use that little trick. I'm going to knit 1 stitch. I'm going to place my beginning of round marker, and it's important that your beginning of round marker looks different from the rest of your stitch markers, so you know which is the marker for the beginning of the round and which are your markers for other points in the round, other spots of the sock, whatever you're using your markers for. It's important that this one is different, which is why I made a little sheep marker. This one's always my beginning of the round marker. And then I'm going to knit halfway across. So once we get to the foot section, which is where I'm at now, I'm done increasing. And we're just going to knit across each round until the sock measures a certain length. So let's go ahead and I want to get all 4 of my needles in here. Alright, so now I get to this longest needle. I'm going to grab one more needle to have on the ready. And I'm going to knit across the first half. Let's see. 8. And then I'll start the next needle. That way I have all 4 needles in, and I'm ready to go. So then as I keep knitting, I'm just going to keep this through. You can see that it's locked into place under this round. It'll just hang out there. So I typically do this if it's plain knitting. I'm just trying to reach to a certain length. This works well for me to know where the beginning of my round was. If I'm knitting in a pattern all the way across the sock and I need to know where the beginning of the round is every single row so that I can start the next round of the pattern, then I'll use an actual stitch marker that moves with me. So now we're just going to keep knitting without increases, just knitting plain stockinette around and around and around until the sock measures the length that the pattern specifies for your size. And you're going to measure from the front of the toe. So I'm going to knit up until some little length so that it's visually clear, and then I will show you how to measure that and we'll move on to the next section. Alright, so now I've knit just a few rows past the toe. I'm not making a full sock, I'm just making enough to show you all the little techniques used. So now we're ready to move on to the gusset. And what we're going to do is knit across the first half of the stitches. So on double pointed, the first half is your first 2 needles. For circular, the first half is just that first needle. We're knitting across the full first half. And then on the next needle, we're going to make one left. So on my third needle, I'm going to make one left, and then I'm going to knit to the end of the round. So I knit all the way to the end. I've knit all of the stitches, and then before I move to the next needle, I'm going to make one right. So I'm adding one stitch to the end of my fourth needle, a stitch onto the end of the round. So now I have 2 more stitches, one at this side, one at this side, all of the increases happening on this second half of stitches. And then the next round, I'm going to knit. And you can see my little working the end of the tail yarn from the toes just hanging out over here. That reminds me, yep, right here is the beginning of my round. Or I have my beginning of the round marker to remind me as well. Alright, now the instructions say repeat rounds 1 to 2 until there are a total of number of stitches. So we're going to repeat that where we're going to increase at the beginning of the third needle and the end of the fourth needle, and then knit the next round. We're going to continue that until we have the number of stitches that it specifies for your size. So we'll repeat round 1, and I'll work that one more time just to show you what it looks like on following rows. So again, we're going to knit across the first half of our stitches, which is needles 1 and 2 if you're on 4 double pointed needles, or the first needle if you're using circulars. The first half if you're doing magic loop. So that's the first 2 needles. It's the first half of our stitches. Now we're going to start the next needle by making 1 left. So we've just increased 1 on the beginning of the second half. And now we knit to the end of the round. We're knitting all the stitches, and then before we move to the next needle, the last thing we're going to do is make 1 right. And then we'll move to round 2 where we just knit. I'm going to work a few increases and then we'll move on to the heel turn. So I've knit a total of about 4 increases now. You can see right here along this line. I've got 4 increases on each side of the sock. Right there. And now I am ready to move on to the heel turn. So in this section, we're going to need a couple more stitch markers. So I'm going to grab a couple out of my little cup here. So I've got them ready to go. I'm going to use those 2. So I'm going to, where's my needle? Alright, so the pattern tells me I'm going to knit a certain number. I'm going to place a marker. I'm going to knit a few more, place a marker, and turn. So while we're doing the heel turn, this is basically, this bottom section of the sock that's little short rows right here, typical of the heel turn on a top-down heel flap sock. It's just going to be a few short rows back and forth to shape the bottom of the heel out. So I'm going to knit. You'll knit however much the pattern tells you for the specific size that you are making. So you'll be working on, when you're doing the short rows, it's going to be the 3rd and 4th needles for double pointeds, the 2nd for circulars. It's the second half of your stitches where you've been doing all these increases. We're going to work some short rows back here. And I'm going to walk through this because I do short rows a little bit differently when it's not a full heel turn like German short rows where you're going back and forth. I like to work my short rows differently. I use yarn overs because it makes it a lot easier in my opinion. Alright, so this is together the 3rd needle, this is the 4th needle. So I've knit the number of stitches that the pattern tells me to knit. I'm going to place a marker, and then I'm going to knit an additional number of stitches. And what it should work out to, if you have the same number of stitches on each needle, so I'm 4 stitches away in the example that I'm using. This is not a size on the pattern, this is just a smaller sample, but I have 4 stitches before the middle of this back. I'm going to knit 4 stitches here, and that should be where it all lines up. We're going to be working the center of these stitches. So I placed my marker. I'll knit another number of stitches that the pattern says to knit. So I'm going to knit an arbitrary 8 stitches so that it lines up the way that yours will. And then I'm going to place a marker, and then I'm going to turn. So I'm literally going to turn it around, and now I'm working on the wrong side of the yarn, on the purl side, and that's what's going to make these short rows. So I'm going to turn. Now for the beginning of row 2, I'm going to yarn over. I like to yarn over backwards when I'm starting a purl row because it locks that yarn over in a little bit better. So I'm going to yarn over. Make sure you don't wrap your stitch marker into the row. Make sure that it's free. I find myself accidentally doing that all the time. And then I'm going to purl up to the next marker. I'll slip the marker and then turn. So I'm going to purl up to the marker. I'm going to slip the marker and I'm going to turn. If you're hearing weird noises in the background, it's because my husband's outside teaching my daughters how to skateboard. So that's what you're hearing. Alright, now I'm going to turn the page on my pattern. Alright, row 3. I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to slip my marker and I'm going to knit up to 1 stitch before the next yarn over. So I'm knitting knit. Alright, and then you can see here's my yarn over. I can tell because there's a gap right here, because this stitch is a little bit funkier than the rest. There's my yarn over. Here's 1 stitch before the yarn over, and I'm going to turn. And now I am going to yarn over and I'm going to purl up to 1 stitch before the next yarn over. So there's my yarn over. You can tell because of the gap, because it doesn't look like one of the regular stitches. So this is 1 stitch before the yarn over, and I'm going to turn. So I'm going to repeat rows 3 to 4 until there are a certain number of stitches, either 6 or 8, between the yarn overs. So here's one of the yarn overs, and between means that you're still working. So on this needle, I have 1, 2, 3, and then there's 1, 2, 3 more stitches before this yarn over. So there's 6 stitches there. In this case, if your size says to go until there are 6 stitches between the yarn overs, this is what it will look like. I'm going to do just maybe 1 more since I'm doing a really tiny size, just so that I can show enough with the next step. Okay, so I've gone till there are 4 stitches between my yarn overs, and now I'm going to yarn over again, and I'm going to, this is what's called next row, right side, yarn over, knit to the first yarn over. So I'm going to knit all the way up to till I reach that yarn over, and now I'm going to knit 2 together to the marker. I'm going to remove the marker and I'm going to knit 2 together 1 more time, and now I'll knit to the end of the round. So this brings us to next round 2, where now we are working back in the round again, and we're going to just knit across. It says knit up to 1 stitch before the first yarn over. So we're going to knit and we're going to go until we are 1 stitch before the first yarn over. So now that I'm at the 3rd needle, I'm going to keep my eye out for that yarn over, which should be right before my stitch marker. So once we've knit up to 1 stitch before the yarn over, I'm going to slip, slip, knit. It also says we're going to remove any stitch marker we pass in this round. And we're going to slip, slip, knit until all of the yarn overs are gone. Slip, slip, knit, slip, slip, knit. And now you can see all of my yarn overs are gone. And I'm going to knit up to the last X number of stitches in the round and place a marker. Again, I'm not following one of the actual sizes, so I'll just go until, let's see, I'll go here. And you can see that I've got these little short rows here, have added a little bit of a rounding to the bottom of the heel, so it shapes out. So now I'm going to knit up to the last, I'll say 5 stitches of mine. I'm going to grab a stitch marker and put it on, place marker. I'm going to slip, slip, knit, and I'm going to turn. Turn the page on my pattern real quick. So this starts our heel flap, or what would be the heel flap portion if we were knitting top down. So I'm going to slip 1, so I'm slipping the stitch that I just decreased, and then I'm going to purl up to the last X number of stitches of the heel. When it says of the heel, that means these last 2 needles that we've been working all the heel sections on. So that's the 3rd needle. If it's double pointed, the 2nd needle. If it's magic loop, but right now we are working that 2nd half of stitches. So I'll just do 5 again, since that's what I did on the other side. So I'm going to purl up to the last X number of stitches. I'm going to place a marker. Place a marker. I'm going to purl 2 together. And I'm going to turn. And now I'm going to slip 1, so slip that stitch that I just decreased, and I'm going to knit up to the marker. just knitting to that next marker. All right, so I've knit right up to the marker. I'm going to slip the marker and I'm going to slip, slip knit again. And then I'm going to turn. I'm going to slip that stitch and then I'm going to purl up to the marker. So I'm purling up to the first marker that I meet moving in this direction. Alright, so now I've made my way up to the marker. I'm going to slip the marker. I'm going to purl two together. And I'm going to turn. And then I'm going to repeat that going back and forth until there are the number of stitches that it tells you should be remaining. So now I've worked a few more decreases. Basically, you're going to decrease until you have 2 more stitches than what you had when you were working just the foot. When the pattern says to repeat those rows 2 and 3 until there are X number of stitches remaining, that means stitches total across all of your needles. If it doesn't specify stitches remaining of the heel or stitches between this section, when it says stitches remaining, that means total stitches remaining. So now that I have X number of stitches remaining, I'm going to move on to next round right side. So I'm going to slip 1, that's the last set that I decreased, and I'm going to knit up to the marker once again. I'm basically repeating round 2 where I'm going to slip 1, I'm going to knit up to the marker, alright, so I've knit up to the marker, I'm going to slip the marker, and I'm going to slip, slip, knit, which brings me to the end of the round. But this time I'm not going to turn. Now we're moving back in the circle. So now you should have 1 more stitch than the total number of stitches you were working around for the foot portion before you started any of the increases for the heel. So now we're working in the round again. We're not turning. This is next round 2. We're going to knit across the first 2 needles. That's the first half of the stitches. These are the stitches that haven't been using while we've been working the heel. The first needle for magic loop or circulars. We're gonna work across all the way this first half of our stitches. Then we're going to knit 2 together, which does that final decrease on this side, and we're going to remove all the markers except the beginning of the round marker and knit to the end of the round. And there we go. Now we're done with the heel, and you can see we've got this nice, we've got our increases here, we've got this little section that flares out to pull the sock out and shape the round edge of your heel. This is what acts as the heel flap, and we have a tiny, sweet little sock. And now we're going to start the leg. So for the leg, the first row, we're just going to knit. And I just realized I never showed you where to measure the sock back in the foot when it says we work the toe and now we knit plain stockinette in the foot until it reaches a certain length. When you're measuring that, you're measuring from the beginning of the toe. So measure all the way from the tip until the point that are on your needles at that point, and then we start the increases for the gusset. I just realized I hadn't mentioned that, and I said I was going to, and I wanted to clarify that. So that's where you're measuring from up to wherever your needles are before you start the gusset. So I knit across one more round. And that was round one of the leg. I'm back to my beginning of round marker. And now we'll begin round two, which is just a repeat that adds a little bit of elasticity in the leg of it so it sits up nicely on the leg and doesn't fall down. So it's a repeat of knit 3, purl 1. So it's a 4-stitch repeat. We're going to knit 1, 2, 3, and purl 1. And we're just going to repeat this all the way around. 1, 2, 3, purl 1, and then we're just going to repeat this pattern across all the way around every round for the number of rounds that it specifies to the size, the number that corresponds to the size that you're knitting. So if you're knitting the first size, the smallest size, it's 16 more rounds that you're going to knit like that. I'm just going to knit a few more rounds like this so that you can see this repeat, and then we will want to move on to the cuff. And there's a little note in there at this point. You'll repeat this for X number of rounds. If you want to knit a taller sock, add more rounds here. So if you see the way that it's pictured in the sample on the cover of the pattern, which is this high where the ruffle sits right above the heel, if you want the ruffle higher up on the leg, add more rounds. So repeat it for an extra 10 or 20 or however many rows, extra rounds that you want to add the height that you're looking for. Go ahead and add that there. And then after I knit a few rounds here, just to show that on this tiny little sample, we'll move on to the cuff. So I went ahead and knit a few rounds of this repeat of knit 3, purl 1, and you can see that it's nice and stretchy. If you want your sock to be taller, at this point, like I said, you're going to keep knitting however many rows. Also, there is an option if you want your ruffle to be a little bit more drapey than what I have in the sample. You can increase your needle size to like a 2 or like a 3 or something like that in the US size. Just go up a couple needle sizes. It'll make your stitches a little bit more loose so it hangs a little bit better. If you do that though, either you need to add more rows here or take some rows out of the length of the ruffle, because when you increase your needle size to make that ruffle, it's going to make the ruffle longer. So in order for it to still look the same and not hang too far down below the heel, either add a few more rows or don't knit as many rows of the ruffle, and then it'll line up at the same spot. If you want your sock to look like the ruffle in my sample, that same way, I used the same needle size for this. But if you don't want it to stick out so much and you want a little bit more drape in that, want it to be a little bit more flowy, you can try going up 1 or 2 needle sizes for that. So let's go ahead and start the cuff. We are going to purl. Round 1 is purl, and it states without the elastic, because at this point we are going to need our elastic thread. Okay, so I've completed round 1, which is just purling across the entire round. Now I'm going to move on to round 2, which uses the elastic thread. So I'm going to be using this now. I'm going to purl 1 with the yarn and the elastic thread. So I'm going to, let's see, put that in the front there. I'm going to purl 1. And then, let me grab that elastic thread. Okay, I'm going to purl 1 with the yarn and the elastic thread. And then I'm going to slip 1 with my yarn in front. So I'm going to move my yarn to the front. I'm going to slip 1 stitch. And then I'm going to repeat that to the end of the round. Knit or purling 1 with both the yarn and the elastic thread, and then slipping 1 stitch with the yarn in front. And that when it says in front, it's the yarn and the elastic thread. I'm going to do a few stitches again with the elastic thread using both the working end and the tail end. It'll lock it in a little bit, and then I don't have to worry about weaving it in when I'm done. Alright, and now I'm going to move on to just the working. So I'm going to slip, and then for the rest of this round I'm going to purl 1, slip 1 with my yarn in front. You can see that I've got the yarn on this side, the right side, and I'm going to repeat that across this entire round. Purl 1 with both, slip 1 with both in front, purl 1 with both, slip 1 with both in front. So now, as you can see, I've gone all the way around my round with that repeat. And now we're going to repeat rounds 1 to 2 for 4 more rounds, which is 2 more repeats. So we're back at row 1, which is to just purl the entire round with just the yarn and not the elastic thread. So we'll go ahead and purl each stitch of yarn and elastic yarn as 1 stitch. So make sure you're not increasing stitches here by purling the yarn and the elastic thread separately. So I went ahead and did a couple more repeats, so it's going to look really crazy like this. Now you are going to do the same thing for, let's see, for 6 more rounds, but without the elastic. So you'll purl 1 round, and then the second round you're going to purl 1, slip 1 with no elastic. And I went ahead and I cut the elastic thread so it's not in the way anymore. And at the end of knitting these rounds, I'm going to go ahead and weave this in because it'll be disappearing in a minute here. I have worked a few more rounds now without the elastic thread. Before you work these without the elastic thread, make sure you try it on. If it feels tight around your ankle, like it's hard to get on, or it's just you don't want it to be any tighter than that getting over your ankle, when you work the next rounds without the elastic, don't use any slip stitches. Just purl the next 12 rounds, or 6 rounds is what it is, the next 6 rounds. Just purl all of those, and that'll keep it from getting too tight. So now, before I move forward, I have this tail end of my elastic thread, and I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to weave this in really quick, and then I can close it up when I fold the cuff over. So all I'm going to do is I have it through a yarn needle, and I'm just going to pick up a couple stitches, go down, and then I'll pick up the backs of a few stitches and go up. And then I'm going to go back where I was, go down, and then go back up. And then I'm going to cut that. Okay, so I've cut that, and you'll notice I wove in on the side that's facing me, and that's because I'm going to fold it over. So this little portion right here, what we're seeing is actually the wrong side, and it's okay if there's a little bit of tail sticking out because we can tuck that in when we do our fold over. So we're going to fold the edge over the outside. So this is the edge. We're going to fold it over outwards. You can see how that folds over nicely and makes a little cuff. And so now the first round of our needles, the current round of our needles matches up with the first round of purl stitches. So we're moving on to the cuff fold over, round 1. We're going to pick up and purl the first purl stitch from the first purl stitch round. So here's my first stitch. I'm going to follow that down. I can see here's my first stitch. I'm going to pick it up with my right needle. So I'm going to pick up that stitch, and I'm going to purl it. And then I'm going to purl 1 from my live stitches. The live stitches are the stitches currently on my needle. And then I'm going to repeat that to the end of the round. So I'm going to go to the next stitch, pick up that first purl bump. Let's get that out of my way for a second here. Put it up on my needle, put my beginning around marker back on, and then I'm going to purl the stitch that I just picked up, and then I'm going to purl 1 stitch off my needle. And then I'm going to come back down here. I'm going to pick up the next purl bump along this bottom edge. I'm going to purl the stitch from that first purl row, and then I'm going to purl a stitch from my needle. And I'm just going to continue to repeat this all the way across this round. I've worked all the way around, folding this over, and you can see now it looks a lot less crazy. And that ends the cuff fold over section. Now we're going to do the ruffle. So we're going to start by turning it. And you can see we have twice the amount of stitches that we started with because of the fold over. So we're going to turn. This way we're working the right side again. If we kept working this way, we would have to purl every single round, because right now we're set up to work the back because we're working back downwards after this fold over. So we're going to turn, and now we're going to work the opposite direction for the rest of the sock. We're going to slip 1, and this is going to help to eliminate the gap from turning it. We're going to slip 1, and then we're going to knit to the end of the round. Now I've come to the end of round 1, and we'll notice that our beginning of round Marker is now at the end of the row, so you can either leave it there or you can go ahead and move it to the next needle. But even if you leave it over here, it'll still remind you that this corner is the beginning of your round. So this is the point now where if you want to switch to a larger needle size for a ruffle that's got a little bit more drape, you're going to go ahead and start that now with round 2. I am going to just stick with the needle size that I'm already using. So I'm going to move on to round 2. Put that down for a second. I'm going to, because there's a small little gap here from turning it around, we're going to pick up 1 stitch before we knit the first stitch, and then we're going to knit 2 together. So by knitting that first stitch together with a stitch in the gap, that pulls the gap up and eliminates it, and now we don't have a hole here from turning the sock around. And now we're going to knit to the end of the round again. Now we're just going to continue to follow the pattern. We're going to knit for the amount of rounds that it says to knit for. So I'll just knit a couple more rounds and then we'll move on to the next round. I just went ahead and knit a couple more rounds since I'm not knitting a full-sized sock. So now I'm going to move on to round 7, which is knit front back, knit 1. Once again, this is going to double the amount of stitches on our needles. By the end of the ruffle, there will be a lot of stitches on your needles. So if you're using circulars, you're doing magic loop especially, or even 2 at a time, there's going to be a lot of stitches on your needles at this point. If you at some point want to move to double pointed instead to make it more comfortable, do whatever you need to do. So round 7, we're going to knit into the front of the stitch, and then before we remove it, we're going to also knit into the back half of the stitch, and then we'll pull it off. Then we're going to knit 1, and we're going to repeat that to the end of the round. And I apologize, it doesn't double our stitches, it'll add 50% of the stitches in addition to what's already on our needles. So we're going to repeat that all the way across this round, where we knit the front and back legs of 1 stitch and then knit 1. And I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we're just going to knit the number of rounds that it tells you without any more increases after that. Right, I did my increases, and then I just knit a couple more rounds. You can see I have a lot of stitches on my needles, and this is a super tiny sock. So you can imagine for a full-size sock, there's going to be a lot of stitches on your needles at this point. But you're almost to the end, so it's not for long. So now we're going to move on to what's labeled next round. We're going to knit 1 and then yarn over, knit 2 together, and knit 1. And then we're going to repeat that across the entire round all the way to the end, and then we'll knit the next 2 rounds plain. So I'm going to go ahead and continue this repeat. I'm going to get this marker out of the way real quick. Knit 2 together, knit 1. I'm now knitting what's labeled next rounds 2 to 3. So I'm just plain stockinette stitch, just plain knitting. Make sure to knit your yarn overs as a stitch each time you come to them. And we'll just do this for 2 rows. Now I'm ready for what's labeled next round 4. I'm going to begin with a yarn over, and then I'm going to knit 2 together, and I'm going to repeat that to the end of the round. So I'll yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, And I'm just going to keep doing that all the way around. So now we've made it all the way across the next round 4. We're going to knit one more round. I'm not going to, since I'm just making a tiny sample, but you'll follow the pattern. Now we're going to bind off, weave at the ends, and block. I do have in the pattern a suggested bind off to help the ruffle not to curl up at the ends. So what I'm going to do is show you that now. I'm going to knit 2. And then I'm going to take the first stitch and pull it over the second. And that binds off 1 stitch. Now I'm going to purl 1. And then I'm going to take the farthest right stitch on my right needle and pass it over the next stitch. And then we'll just keep doing that. So now I'll knit 1. And pass that first stitch over, and then I'll purl 1, and I'll pass that first stitch over. When you get to the last stitch and there's only 1 stitch on your right needle and there's no more stitches to bind off, you're going to cut your tail end and then just pull this stitch out. So once you bind off all your stitches, you have this super giant crazy ruffle. And I am a firm believer in blocking your projects, but this especially should be blocked because of the ruffle. And I do have in the pattern some written instructions to help you block it so it lays flat. You can see this picture down here as an example. But basically what you want to do, you want to take this sock, submerge it into warm water, and let it soak for a minute. You're going to wring out all the water, get it as dry as possible. And then I suggest putting it on a sock blocker to help shape the sock. If you don't have one, you can make one out of cardboard. Just trace a sock that you own, cut that out, and stick that into the block. If you don't want to use one, that's up to you, but you should at least get the ruffle to lay flat. So what I suggest is taking one of your knitting needles, whether it's double pointed, circular, whatever it is, and while it's wet, weave it in and out. So you're going to kind of fold the ruffle down so that it hugs tight to the sock. And you're just going to weave the needle through it. And then you'll turn it over and do the same size. So you're basically going to kind of pleat, fold, fold, fold all the ruffles down. And then you'll take a needle and put it through those. And so while it's blocking, it's going to look like that. So you can see it's a lot more under control now. And you'll just leave these needles in here while it blocks. When it's dry, you can take them out. And then it's a lot more under control. You can see this ruffle isn't crazy out to the side. This ruffle looked exactly like this one, where it was basically just a big giant crazy circle, but by folding it and pleating it and blocking it, it looks much, much better. So that is the MiRu Ruffle Sock tutorial. Hopefully that helps you with the pattern. If there's any other questions you have, reach out to your local yarn store first. They're always really great help with little techniques if there's a specific technique you're having a hard time with, or if there's something pattern specific that you think might be an error, or you want help just explaining it a little bit farther, feel free to reach out to me. Happy knitting!